Hello, everyone. Thank you for accessing this presentation. I'll be talking about integrating EAP into the wider university curriculum for generative AI. And I'll be illustrating that through a case study of collaboration I was doing between EAP and classics, the study of the ancient world. Why classics? Because I'm wearing two hats. I'm an EAP practitioner at the University of Manchester, but I'm also doing a second doctorate in classics, looking at Homer's speeches. And as I've been working on this, I've been kind of becoming increasingly aware that actually EAP does have relevance for other subjects, and there's more potential for collaboration. So though EAP and classics are very different fields, classics has been studied for thousands of years, literally, and EAP is relatively new. There's many ways that they can inform each other. And one of the main arguments we're making in this is that by bringing EAP into other disciplines, we're making our field more visible and showing exactly how we contribute. So I'll be describing my project. At the end, I'll give the reference and I'll also give my own email. So should you have any other questions, you can contact me. Okay. Yeah, so what is classics for those people who are not familiar with it? It's actually got a very wide kind of platform of content areas based around the ancient Greeks and the Romans. But traditionally, most of it has been based around literature, philosophy, history, and art. This is changing because classics actually is very open to innovation. So it's actually become very interdisciplinary now. So it's a very different subject from when I studied it as an undergraduate in the 1980s. It has got that reputation of being rather exclusive, even elitist, and it's kind of constantly reinventing itself to kind of appeal to a wider audience. But it's fair to say that classics is a very established subject, and it's got a definite niche. I personally enjoy it. I do think it's got a lot to contribute to education at any level it's studied at. So my work was within this area. In terms of the connection between classics and EAP, well, going back to the academy, the original academy was Plato's academy, where Socrates would surround himself with his disciples and they would look at the pursuit of knowledge. Now, to gain knowledge, which was never considered as absolute but relative, I think you could read into it this idea of finding your voice, which in the Republic is expressed as looking the right way. So it's all about inquiry, really. And this, I mean, voice is not something which was used by Plato as a term in the sense it's used in the EAP, but classic students find it very difficult to find a voice because when there's been scholarship on the subject for thousands of years, it can be quite daunting. Okay, what can I contribute to the field? But I do think generative AI can be part of this process of finding your voice within classics, looking the right way, and contributing to a field which has got a very long and rich tradition in scholarship. Gen AI has been used in classics quite a lot, as in other subjects. Just to give a few very select examples here. Translation is very important in classics when people are working with the original Latin and Greek texts. And obviously there are different ways of translating texts. So Gen AI has been used to compare and generate different texts. There are also people who are interested in writing Latin and Greek as well. Maybe it's a technical exercise, maybe it's literature. And Gen AI has been used to create texts and again, compare them. And finally, which I find very interesting, which is close to my own project, it's been used in inquiry-based learning, which looks at learning as a process and a problem-solving exercise. So engaging learners in the learning process and thereby coming at different routes to knowledge. So Pedar here, he used chatbots for students to actually interrogate figures from the ancient world and find out how they would have reacted and what they would have done in certain situations. And there was a large element of gamification there. So Gen AI is being used in classics. It's quite exploratory, but the work I've been doing is not exactly new ground. Okay, so in my project, what I was aiming at I was looking at the speeches in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey and how they can be interpreted, can be interpreted. Now there is a lot of scholarship on this because speeches make up a lot of the Iliad and Odyssey. But I was looking at Gen AI as an avenue for students to kind of start working or progress their work. Yeah, and in terms of discourse competence, students need to engage with the speeches, and it's very important in classics how you kind of use the source material, which is written in the original Latin or Greek, not just translating that, but relating it to a theoretical framework and then articulating your own interpretation in English. So that is the main challenge when working literary texts in classics. How you make sense of the ancient language using a range of different scholarships, and then finally, crucially, the academic writing, which provides an argument to a contemporary reader. So I was focusing on the Iliad and the Odyssey, just to give some background on these two great poems. They basically describe episodes from the Trojan War, which may or may not have happened about 3,000 years ago. Originally, there were many poems in the cycle, but we only have these two great poems outstanding. It's important for scholars to realise that the original composition was oral. Only much later were they written down. So the idea of text is something we talk about a lot in EAP, but the status of the text is very much debated when it comes to the Iliad and the Odyssey. Yeah, and my particular interest was in direct speech. So almost like plays, or more than half of the Iliad and the Odyssey is actually character speech, where characters are in speaking to each other in arguments or discussion or whatever, or conversational exchanges. So I was looking at generative AI as a tool for unlocking the significance of those speeches, which I'll illustrate in a minute. So the methodology I used, rather simple actually. So I used Microsoft Copilot simply to ask questions about the content of a language and how they connected of the Iliad and the Odyssey. But the next stage, of course, was to compare the responses of Copilot with the massive scholarship which already exists on the Iliad and the Odyssey. And this is where criticality comes in, because Copilot was never the end of the process. The discourse competence comes in because you need to, as a scholar, you need to reconcile your interpretation with a Gen AI response and the large literature. So this is what I was aiming to do in my research project. So I used a range of prompts on the speeches in these two poems, just to give two examples here. The first one's quite linguistic. So I looked at a passage in the Iliad where Achilles, who is the main hero, is speaking to his best friend, Patroclus, and he uses quite an interesting simile there. So I wanted ChatGPT to actually kind of unpack that simile, translate it, of course, and what it actually meant in terms of the whole developing narrative of the poem. The second thing is a bit more like role play, really. Moving on to the Odyssey, I looked at a passage where Odysseus, who is disguised as a beggar, gets into a conversation with a really horrible woman called Melantho. And I wanted to kind of look at the thought process of Odysseus, and when he was making his speech, when he's actually in disguise, what he was actually thinking of. So two quite different prompts there I was using to elicit information to inform my own interpretation and worldview of the speeches. I'm not going to analyze the data in detail, wouldn't be appropriate here, but just to give kind of the results from a kind of interdisciplinary perspective. The first thing is there was a lot of talk about hallucinations in Gen AI, but there was a lot, it was almost completely accurate in terms of the content. So, for example, the translations were very accurate. There were a few flaws. So when I say largely, that wasn't completely, but the Gen AI response actually was very accurate in terms of the translation and how it reacted to the content. There was also a great deal of material generated, which is where criticality comes in, because the student would need to go through that and decide what was relevant to their own research question. So the study of the speech is a huge area. So what was actually useful for them in their actual project? That would involve quite a lot of criticality to kind of find your voice. Yeah, the interesting thing was, although the responses were very full, there's still plenty of areas where the student can actually develop the response. So the GenAI, it could be seen as a starting place for opening up multiple directions of inquiry. So GenAI is not the answer, but it gives a stimulus and a good starting place. Yeah, I mean the next thing, of course, it's actually great fun because you can ask some really wacky questions and get some very interesting responses. So classics can be seen as quite a dry subject. So we're always looking for kind of exciting interactive methodologies. And I think the use of GenAI made it interactive and also spawned genuine scholarship. So looking at the wider implications beyond this specific field of classics, I do think that GenAI can be a very useful tool in engaging students in the practice of a discipline, because I see, and there are many definitions of EAP, but I see the main function of EAP as developing discourse competence, allowing students to negotiate the practices of their discipline. So in classics, students need to be able to engage with the ancient sources and produce a meaningful and coherent response, which is based on the literature, but also allows them to articulate their own voice. And GenAI was very valuable in this process. With caveats, of course, that GenAI cannot replace scholarship. So it's impossible to use this without being an expert or specialist on your actual area. So, for example, I could not have done this if I didn't know Greek. So GenAI is not going to replace scholarship, but it's going to be a partner in that process. Yeah, and as many scholars have pointed out, I said at the beginning of the presentation, by aligning ourselves with disciplines, looking at their practice, this is how we raise the profile of EAP as a field and our own very valuable work as EAP practitioners, especially in this fragile time. So that is a link to the full paper. It's written mainly for students and educators in classics, but I have tried to emphasize how it connects to discourse competence, which is very much the kind of sphere of EAP. Those are my references. And there's my email, should you want to contact me about anything. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the other talks in this event. Thank you.